Thank you. Thank you. It's couldn't be a better setting to be in an iconic store, purveyors of the word, to be discussing two men who made their lives through the word. When Michael and I were talking, we thought we'd start with Pulitzer for the obvious reason that he comes first chronologically, and in some ways creates the stage that somebody like Rupert Murdoch will waltz onto later. When I started this book a mere 6 years ago, and I told people I was writing about Joseph Pulitzer, you'd get two reactions from people. The first is a sort of excitement, oh, Joseph Pulitzer, and then there'd be this long pause, because Pulitzer is one of these odd ducks from history. We all know his name, but we don't know what he did, like Alfred Nobel. Few people remember what line of business he was in, ironically creating the Peace Prize. Well, everybody knows the Pulitzer Prize, but they don't know Joseph Pulitzer. This was fortunate for me, unfortunate for Pulitzer. Fortunate for me because I found that there's a great tale to be told, and a significantly important one. I joke sometimes that what was so great about writing about Pulitzer was even if I did a bad job, the tale of his life is a great story. But more than telling a great story, what Pulitzer did in his time makes him as significant a 19th century figure as the other names whose actions we know. Carnegie, who gave us steel, Morgan, who gave us our system of finance, Rockefeller and oil. Pulitzer was one of those giants that changed the world in the 19th century, and the way he changed it still affects us to this day. The habits we have in consuming news, the idea of news as a story, of selling news, these are many of the things that come from him. Now, it's a generalization, and I always want to be careful in this. Pulitzer is to journalism and the change that occurs in journalism much the way Picasso is to the Cubist movement. Pulitzer was not alone. There are many others who were doing what he was doing, but he was the iconic member who really led this group. And his story is also the story of 1,000 or 1,000,000 Americans. He comes to the United States as a penniless Hungarian Jewish immigrant and lands here to work in the Civil War as a mercenary soldier. That was his ticket out of Europe. And after the war, like many immigrants, he was, like many of the veterans then, he was unemployed, and he sought his place in the New World, and he went to St. Louis. The reason he went to St. Louis is there were so many Germans, and he spoke German because Hungary at that point, that was the language you were taught in school, that St. Louis was like going, for a German would be like a Latino choosing certain places in the United States to settle where Spanish is spoken. You wouldn't necessarily, if you came from Central America, move to Iowa. Well, he chose to go to St. Louis because it was a German-speaking town at that point, and he entered the hurly-burly world of immigrant politics. This becomes an important aspect of his life because politics and journalism at that point were two sides of the same coin. To give you a clue, the two predominant newspapers in St. Louis, one was called the Missouri Democrat, and the other was called the Missouri Republican. But there were also an active field of German-language newspapers, 6 or 7 that were published every day. So Pulitzer modeled himself on a rising German politician, Karl Schurz, and was planning on doing the same thing. And he becomes elected to the state legislature, and to get the story exciting and to please me as an author, he engages in such mild activity as taking a shot at a lobbyist. And then he's defeated in politics. And like most politicians back then who was defeated in politics, he re-enters the world of journalism. Successful editors became elected politicians, unsuccessful politicians became editors. And in this accident of fate, he changes journalism in remarkable ways, which we'll be talking about tonight. But just to give you a tidbit of it, in 1878, when he buys a bankrupt newspaper in St. Louis, he sees things and trends in journalism that nobody else sees. He's not an Edison. He doesn't invent something. But here he is in 1878 spending his last pennies to buy a bankrupt newspaper on the courthouse steps. This is a bankruptcy sale. And the papers at that point were morning papers. So for most people, this is a suicidal act. Why would you be buying a bankrupt newspaper that comes out in the afternoon? And this is the genius of Pulitzer. He begins to perceive things that the others don't. He sees with industrialization that people are moving to cities and they're now commuting to work, meaning on the ride home, they need something to read. There's gaslight, electric light, They need something to read. And more important, he decides he can mine the Victorian internet, the telegraph. News could come from Washington and New York that is fresh from that morning's proceedings in Congress. So when he published that afternoon paper and handed it out to these folks on the trolleys, he was giving them the latest possible news, and the morning papers were publishing literally yesterday's news. And that's just an example of the kind of innovation he was responsible for. But St. Louis is the backwaters. The show was New York. Just down the road from here, Park Row is where all the big papers were published. So think of him as running a Broadway play that's playing in the hinterlands that he wants to bring to New York. And he repeats the act. In 1883, he buys a bankrupt newspaper that most people have never heard of, but it rises up to become the most powerful newspaper in the United States, the New York World, using his techniques that he developed in St. Louis. And when I say powerful, the World was so strong that if you want to play some math games and compare the population of the United States back then to today, circulation of newspapers, the New York Times would have to increase its circulation a mere 300% to match the power that Pulitzer had in circulation alone. But beyond numbers, he had such national influence that in the archives I would find letters from governors in states like Oregon asking for his endorsement. That shows you the reach of that paper. So what was the magic that he brought to New York? Well, one of the aspects of the magic is that he could see, again, we're talking about trends, he could see this massive wave of immigrants coming to New York. The other newspapers saw them as a threat. He saw them as an important part of New York life. And he admonished his reporters to go out and cover their lives, to write about their lives. And it was often gruesome. It would be deaths of children from disease, kids falling off the roofs of tenement houses, kids being beaten up by the police, labor unions being smashed. And so he'd cover it in this dramatic fashion, short, punchy prose. And the upper class, who are buying more expensive newspapers, would claim this is sensationalistic stuff. Well, it wasn't. It was to them. But the magic is if you went down to the Lower East Side and went into a black and tan bar, or you went into a settlement house's dining hall, the room where they gathered to eat dinner, what would they be talking about that day? They would be talking about how Mrs. O'Shaughnessy's baby died, how there was no medical care, all of the things they saw in the World newspaper. And the World newspaper was available for a penny. So their world was given meaning and was interpreted through this dramatic newspaper, and that wasn't the end of it. On Sunday, you could buy a newspaper in color, thick as a telephone book, with recipes, dress patterns, even sheet music that you could play at night with your family. So Pulitzer was feeding this group with things that mattered to them, and of course the quid pro quo was they were sending their pennies to him, and that's how he became so wealthy. And in a little while we'll talk a little bit about some of the physical changes he made to New York, which were dramatic. And what I particularly like about his paper, and what's fun about talking about it, is of course the title of the newspaper is The World. And since none of us know about it, we're really going to be describing a lost world, a world that shaped our newspaper habits, our reading habits, made news interesting, made news something we sought to buy, and in some ways, I would argue, created the stage that Rupert Murdoch walks on and Michael Wolff chronicles in his book.
That was great.
Oh, thank you.
This may be the last time newspapers guys are discussed in, at least on television in New York. This is really the last days of this subject, the last days when anyone is going to be interested in newspapers, I guess in almost any way. The curious thing about my guy, about who I've in my mind some time ago started to think of as my Uncle Rupert, is that I've grown up as a journalist, and the villain in my business has always been Rupert Murdoch. From when, especially in New York, from when he first came here in when he bought the New York Post and took over New York Magazine in 1978, became anathema. He became the destroyer of journalism. Everything that was bad and evil about journalism was personified by Murdoch.